I was just trying to find a place to live. Moving to a new city is hard enough, and finding an apartment is even harder. I was running out of time. My job started in just a few days, and I still had nowhere to stay. Hotels were too expensive, and all the apartments I found were either way out of my budget or already rented. Then I stumbled upon an ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. It was for a one-bedroom apartment in a quiet part of town. The pictures looked great. Clean rooms, hardwood floors, and big windows. And the price was almost too good to be true. For a second, I thought there had to be a catch, but the listing didn't say anything strange. It just said the apartment was available immediately and would be rented on a first-come, first-served basis. There was only an email address for contact. I quickly wrote a message saying I was interested and waited. After about an hour, I got a reply. "Hello, thank you for your interest. I can show you the apartment today if you're free. Let me know what time works for you." The message was short, but I was relieved. I was sure the apartment would be snatched up quickly, so I replied right away, asking if I could come by that afternoon. The owner gave me an address and a time. It was a bit outside the city center, in a quiet area with rows of older brick buildings. I arrived at the address around 3 p.m. The building looked just like the photos. It was a little old but in good shape. I felt a rush of excitement. I could already imagine myself living there. I knocked on the door of apartment 6 just as the owner had instructed. After a few moments, the door opened slightly and a man peered out. He was older, probably in his 60s, with a gray beard and glasses. "You must be Casey," he said with a polite smile, opening the door wider. "Yes, that's me," I replied, smiling back. He motioned for me to come inside. The apartment was even better in person. It was clean, with large windows letting in lots of light. There was a faint smell of something sweet, like fresh flowers, but I couldn't see any in the room. "It's a nice place," I said, looking around. The man nodded. "Yes, it is. It belonged to my sister, actually. She passed away recently, so I'm looking for someone to rent it out." "Oh, I'm sorry for your loss," I replied. He gave a small smile. "Thank you." She was a quiet person, kept to herself mostly. I felt a bit awkward, unsure what to say. I looked around the living room again. There were no personal items, just some basic furniture, a couch, a coffee table, and a few chairs. It seemed almost too clean, like no one had lived there for a long time. "Well, if you're interested, you can move in as soon as you like," he said suddenly. "Really?" I asked, surprised. Usually, there would be paperwork, a lease to sign, background checks, but he seemed ready to hand over the keys right there. "Yes, I just need the first month's rent and it's yours," he said with a friendly smile. Something felt strange, but I brushed the feeling off. I was desperate and this place was exactly what I needed, so I agreed. The next day, I moved in. I only had a few bags with me, so it didn't take long to get settled. The man, Mr. Dawson, handed me the keys and told me to call if I needed anything. Then he left. For the first couple of hours, everything was fine. I unpacked my things, set up my bed, and started to feel at home. But that night, things started to get strange. Around midnight, as I was lying in bed, I heard a faint knocking sound. It was soft, almost like someone gently tapping on the wall. At first, I thought it was coming from the apartment next door, but the building was supposed to be empty. Mr. Dawson had mentioned that most of the units were vacant. The knocking continued, slow and steady. It seemed to be coming from somewhere inside my apartment. I got out of bed, turned on the lights and walked around, trying to find the source of the sound. It was louder near the kitchen, but as soon as I stepped into the kitchen, the knocking stopped. I stood there for a minute, listening. The apartment was completely silent. I shrugged, telling myself it was probably just the pipes or something, and went back to bed. But as soon as I turned off the light, the knocking started again. This time, it was louder. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head. Eventually, I fell asleep, but the sound followed me into my dreams, a slow, steady tapping that seemed to echo in my mind. The next day, I tried to put the strange noises out of my head. I went to work, came back, and tried to relax. But that night, the knocking returned. It was louder than before, and this time, it sounded almost like footsteps, moving slowly across the floor above me. I went upstairs to see if there was anyone there, but the hall was dark and empty. I called Mr. Dawson the next day, telling him about the sounds I was hearing. "Oh, I'm sure it's just the old building settling," he said. "Sometimes these places make strange noises. It's nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe him, but something felt off. Still, I tried to ignore it. But the next night, things got worse. This time, it wasn't just knocking. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was soft, almost like someone was standing right next to my bed, speaking in a low voice. My heart pounded as I sat up, looking around the dark room. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling ridiculous. The whispering stopped. The room was silent again. I reached over and turned on the light, but there was no one there. I barely slept that night, lying in bed with the light on, listening to every little creak and rustle. I was starting to think I was losing my mind. The next day, I decided to do some research. I looked up the building online, trying to see if there were any stories about it. After an hour of searching, I found an old newspaper article about a woman who had died in the apartment. Her name was Emily Dawson, Mr. Dawson's sister. The article said that she had lived alone and had been found dead in her bedroom. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, but some neighbors had reported hearing strange noises coming from her apartment in the days before her death. This revelation sent chills down my spine. That night, the knocking and whispering returned, even louder than before. I tried to sleep, but it was impossible. Around 3 a.m., I finally snapped. I got out of bed and shouted, "What do you want?" For a moment, everything was silent. Then, I heard a voice, clear as day, right next to my ear. "Leave." I ran out of the apartment, not stopping until I was outside, breathing heavily in the cool night air. I didn't go back. The next day, I packed up my things and found a cheap motel. I called Mr. Dawson, telling him I couldn't stay there anymore. He didn't sound surprised. "I understand," he said simply before hanging up. Looking back, I don't know if I imagined everything or if there was really something in that apartment, but one thing is certain: I'll never rent a place from Craigslist again. I was desperate for a job, bills were piling up, and I hadn't had any luck finding work in months. My friends suggested I check out Craigslist, saying I could find all sorts of random gigs there. I'd never used it before, but I figured it was worth a shot. After scrolling through countless ads, one listing caught my eye. It was titled, "Night Watchman Needed, Great Pay, No Experience Required." The pay was way above anything else I'd seen, and the hours were perfect. I was a night owl anyway, so working from midnight to dawn didn't seem too bad. The ad didn't provide much information, just a phone number and a brief note. "Looking for someone reliable to watch over the building. Must be okay working alone at night. No questions asked." I called the number and got a man named Mr. Grayson. He sounded older with a deep, raspy voice, but he was polite. He explained that the job was simple. I'd just have to monitor an old abandoned building downtown for 6 hours each night. It used to be an office space, but it had been empty for years. "Why does it need watching if it's empty?" I asked, curious. "Just routine. Sometimes people break in," he said shortly. "But you won't have to deal with anyone directly. Just call me if you see anything unusual." The whole thing sounded strange, but the pay was too good to pass up, so I accepted. I showed up at the building the next night, just before midnight. It was an old, towering structure with faded windows and chipped paint, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Mr. Grayson was waiting for me out front, holding a set of keys. He looked exactly how he sounded, older, with a thin frame and a face etched with wrinkles. "Just stay in the lobby," he said, handing me the keys. "Don't wander upstairs, and don't worry if you hear any noises. This place makes all sorts of sounds at night." I wanted to ask more, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the night. I was left standing alone in front of the building. I went inside, closing the heavy door behind me. The lobby was large and empty, with cracked tile floors and old furniture covered in dust. There was a single chair in the corner, next to a small table with a flashlight and a notepad. The place smelled musty, like it hadn't seen fresh air in ages. I sat down, trying to get comfortable. There were no windows in the lobby, just a single light overhead casting a dim glow. I glanced at my phone. 12:05 a.m. Only 6 hours to go. For the first hour, everything was fine. I spent most of it scrolling through my phone, barely paying attention to my surroundings. But around 1 a.m., I started to hear noises. At first, it was just a faint creaking, like footsteps on old wood. I brushed it off, remembering what Mr. Grayson had said about the building's sounds. But as the minutes passed, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, faint whispers. The sound of something moving down the hallway. I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept reminding myself that the building was empty. There was no one here but me. Still, the sounds didn't stop. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my phone. But then, around 2 a.m., I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, whispering from somewhere deep in the building. "Help me." I froze, barely daring to breathe. The voice was soft, almost pleading, echoing faintly down the hallway leading to the lobby. It sounded close, but also distant, like it was coming from somewhere deep within the building. I stood up, gripping the flashlight on the table. Every instinct told me to leave, to just walk out and never come back. But something compelled me to stay. Maybe it was the pay, maybe it was simple curiosity, or maybe it was the hope that someone really was in there, needing help. I slowly stepped toward the hallway. The air felt colder, and the smell of dampness grew stronger as I walked. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked walls and dusty floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I took a few more steps, peering around, but the hall stretched on endlessly, disappearing into shadows. I was about to turn back when I heard the voice again. "Help me, please." It was louder this time, coming from a door at the end of the hallway. I walked toward it, my heart pounding. As I reached the door, I noticed a sign above it. "Basement." I hesitated. There was no way I was going down there. But the voice echoed again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Please." I couldn't ignore it. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and shined the flashlight down the staircase. The steps descended into complete darkness. Each step creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder the farther I went. Finally, I reached the bottom, where a long hallway stretched out before me. At the end of the hallway, I saw a door slightly ajar, with a faint light glowing from inside. I took a shaky step forward, and then another, until I was standing just outside the door. Finally, I pushed it open, the old hinges groaning. Inside was a small, empty room with nothing but a single chair in the center. I shined the flashlight around, but the room was dead silent, but I felt a strange sense of unease, like I was being watched. Then I noticed something on the wall. Faint scratches, like words carved into the plaster. I moved closer, squinting to read them. "Please help me. I'm still here." The words were scrawled over and over, in shaky handwriting, covering the entire wall. I stumbled back, my heart racing. And then I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, coming down the hallway toward the basement. I turned off the flashlight, standing perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the darkness. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. There was no other way out of the room. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. For a few agonizing moments, everything was silent. And then I heard a voice, soft and raspy, whispering right next to my ear. "Why did you come here?" I stumbled back, switching on the flashlight. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. The footsteps, the whispers, everything was gone. I ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. I didn't stop until I burst out into the night air, slamming the door shut behind me. I called Mr. Grayson the next morning, telling him I couldn't do the job anymore. "I understand," he said quietly, like he'd been expecting it. Before I hung up, I asked him, "Has anyone else worked as a watchman there?" He was silent for a moment. "Yes, but none of them lasted very long." I didn't ask anything else. I hung up and blocked his number. To this day, I still think about the voice, those scratches on the wall. Part of me wonders if someone really was trapped down there, left behind in that cold, dark basement, but I'll never go back to find out. I'd rather live with the mystery than face whatever's hiding in that building. And I'll never look for a job on Craigslist again. It all started when I was browsing Craigslist one night. I was looking for furniture for my new apartment. Money was tight, so I thought I'd check the free section to see if anyone nearby was giving anything decent away. Most of it was junk, but then something caught my eye. It was a mirror, tall, antique, with an ornately carved wooden frame. It was beautiful and exactly the kind of unique piece I wanted for my place. The post was vague, though. It just read, "Antique mirror, free to a good home. Must pick up tonight." There was a phone number, but no other information. Excited, I texted the number right away, asking if the mirror was still available. Within minutes, I got a reply. "Yes, it's yours if you can pick it up tonight. I need it gone." I thought it was a bit strange to insist on getting rid of it so quickly, but I was too thrilled to care. I agreed, and the person sent me an address across town. It was late, but I grabbed my keys and headed out, hoping it wasn't a scam. When I arrived, I found myself in front of a small old house at the end of a narrow street. The yard was overgrown, and the windows were dark. I almost turned around, thinking I had the wrong place. But then the door opened, and an older woman stepped outside. "You must be here for the mirror," she said, her voice quiet. I nodded, trying to hide my nervousness. The woman was thin, with tired eyes and gray hair pulled back in a loose bun. She didn't say anything else, just motioned for me to follow her inside. The house was dimly lit, with a faint smell of old wood and dust. She led me to the living room, where the mirror stood against the wall. It was even more beautiful in person, taller than I'd expected, with intricate carvings all around the frame. But there was something odd about it. The glass had a slightly cloudy look, like it hadn't been cleaned in years, even though the frame was in perfect condition. The house was dimly lit with... "It's beautiful," I said, reaching out to touch the frame. The woman pulled back my hand, shaking her head. "Don't touch it, not yet." Her tone was stern, almost fearful. She looked at me, her expression serious. "Once you take it, you can never bring it back," she said quietly. "Do you understand?" I nodded, though I didn't really know what she meant. It seemed like she wanted to get rid of it more than anything, and if taking it would make her feel better, I wasn't going to argue. I'd never been superstitious, and I figured it was just an old woman being cautious. She helped me load the mirror into my car, but she barely said a word. As soon as it was secured, she turned and walked back inside without even saying goodbye. I shrugged it off, figuring she was just a little eccentric. Back at my apartment, I set the mirror up in the living room. I leaned it against the wall, taking a moment to admire it. It really was a stunning piece, and I couldn't believe it had been free. But as I looked at my reflection, I noticed something odd. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange feeling. Like the image in the mirror wasn't quite right. My reflection looked back at me, of course, but there was something slightly off. I couldn't pinpoint what it was, but the more I stared, the more uneasy I felt. I finally pulled myself away, telling myself I was being paranoid. I was tired. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I decided to head to bed and deal with it in the morning. That night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on a door. At first, I thought it was coming from my front door. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it was coming from the living room. My heart started to pound as I sat up, trying to shake off the grogginess. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, echoing through the apartment. I got out of bed and walked slowly toward the living room, my footsteps barely making a sound on the floor. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The tapping was coming from the mirror. I stared at it, not daring to move. The mirror was completely still, but the tapping continued, coming from somewhere deep within the glass. I stepped closer, holding my breath, and then the sound stopped. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching my reflection in the dim light. My reflection stared back, looking as shaken as I felt, but then I saw it. The reflection in the mirror blinked. I hadn't blinked. I was sure of it. I took a step back, my heart racing. But as I did, the reflection didn't move. It stood there, watching me, its eyes dark and expressionless. I backed out of the room, not taking my eyes off the mirror until I was in the hallway. I stumbled back to my bedroom, closing the door and locking it, even though I knew that wouldn't do any good. I lay in bed, my heart pounding, trying to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I called the woman who'd given me the mirror, but the number was disconnected. I tried searching for the address online, but it didn't show up. It was like she and the house had never existed. The next day, I called. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Every time I looked in the mirror, I felt like something was watching me. The reflection would change when I wasn't looking. Subtle differences, like a shadow shifting or an expression that didn't match mine. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection smiling when I wasn't, or looking away when I was staring straight ahead. Then, one night, I saw something I couldn't ignore. I was sitting on the couch, trying to avoid looking at the mirror, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I glanced over, and my blood ran cold. I was sitting in the mirror. My reflection wasn't. There was something standing behind it, a dark figure with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It was tall, looming over my reflection, its face barely visible in the shadows. I turned around, but there was no one there. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a sheet and threw it over the mirror, covering it completely. But even then, I could feel it, like there was something lurking just behind the glass, waiting for me to look. That night, I had a nightmare. I was standing in front of the mirror, staring into it. My reflection looked back, but it wasn't me. Its eyes were dark, empty, and its smile was twisted and wrong. Slowly, it raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. Then, it began to knock, a slow, steady tapping that echoed in my mind. That night, I had a nightmare. When I woke up, the tapping was real. I could hear it coming from the living room, louder than ever. I lay there, paralyzed, as the tapping grew louder, faster, more insistent. When I woke up, finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, walked to the living room, and ripped the sheet off the mirror. The tapping stopped. My reflection stared back at me, normal again, but I knew I couldn't keep it. Whatever was in that mirror, it wasn't going to let me rest. The next morning, I loaded the mirror into my car and drove as far as I could. I stopped at a deserted stretch of road and left it there, covered with the sheet. I didn't care who found it. I just needed it gone. It's been a few weeks now, and I still feel uneasy, like something's watching me. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping sound, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere deep in the dark. And every time I pass a mirror, I feel compelled to look, even though I'm terrified of what I might see staring back at me.